Okay, so I've seen a couple questions in the Foundry Discord about how to get debugging working for VS Code, and it's pretty straightforward for client-side stuff. So this is going to be a short tutorial to walk you through how to get that set up. So first things first, we need to make sure Foundry is actually running. So in my case, I'm going to run the Node version from the command line, but if you're using the Express desktop app version, that will also work perfectly fine. So now that Foundry is running, let's just double check real quick that it is in fact on. And you can see on our local host, and make a note of your port here because you'll need that later. It is indeed listening. We'll go ahead and close this browser window because we don't need it for now. And then we're going to go ahead and open up our VS Code text editor. Now, in my case, this is my Foundry data folder. And in my modules folder, what I've done is I've created a small demo module that is very simple. And that's what we're going to be using for this little tutorial. All it is a demo module, bog standard, not much going on here. And it just calls in one JavaScript file that we'll take a look at here, which all that does is it hooks on ready and prints a message to the console. So very, very easy. Just a very simple demo module. So in order to get debugging actually working, you need a few things set up first. So the first thing to do is go to your extensions tab in VS Code, which you can get to either clicking here or Control-Shift-X. And you need to install a client-side debugger extension. Now there's one for Chrome and there's one for Firefox. Personally, I use the Chrome one, but the Firefox one should work perfectly fine as well. If it's not showing up here under the recommended modules for you for whatever reason, up here you can search for it. Debugger for Chrome. Just find it and click install. Now it should be ready to go, and you don't necessarily need to reload VS Code, but just to be safe, I'll go ahead and close it, relaunch, and then confirm that it now shows up under enabled. So debugger for Chrome enabled. Now, at this point, you can go to your debugger tab or the run tab. Again, either clicking here on this tab or Control-Shift-D is the hotkey. Now, it's going to tell you that you don't have a launch.json file set up for this project. But if you click right here, it will automatically help you make one. And in this case, we're going to create a Chrome launch.json entry. Now, if you wanted to debug the server side of Foundry, the Express web server sort of stuff, then that would be a Node.js debugger instead, but we're not going to cover that in this tutorial since that's not as common for things like module development. So right here, we're going to click on Chrome, and that's going to set up a boilerplate template for debugging client-side with the Chrome extension. Now, remember earlier we said to make a note of your port, you need to plug that in here so that the debugger knows where to connect to your app that's running. And then make sure you save your launch.json so that change will be remembered. And if we go back to our module directory here, you can see VS Code has created a .vscode config directory with your launch.json file in it. Now, one thing that you might want to do real quick is if you have a getignore already, you can just add it there. I'm going to go ahead and create a getignore file and just tell get to ignore this VS Code directory so it doesn't end up saved to our version control. If you're not using Git, then that step can be safely ignored. You don't necessarily need to do that. So now you should have everything set up that you need to actually do some debugging. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our, we're going to select our actual module JavaScript file, and then we're going to go to our run tab again. And we're going to say launch Chrome against localhost, click run, and that will automatically open up a Chrome browser. However, you'll notice that over here, VS Code now has the debug console actually linked to this instance of your Chrome browser's debug console. So if we go ahead and log into our world, you'll see all of the normal stuff that shows up in Foundry's console being mirrored across here to your debug console in VSCode, and so that lets you know that it is indeed working. However, if you want to actually do some debugging, then you'll need to go back to your JavaScript files, or whatever you're working with, and set up some breakpoints. So we'll do a very simple breakpoint here that fires as soon as it gets to this console log statement. Just click here in the margin to set a breakpoint. And since this doesn't actually fire except when the ready hook fires, we'll need to reload the page here to get that to happen. So once we do that, you'll see this time Foundry has paused in its execution during the loading phase, or the ready phase. And in VS Code, you'll see this line is highlighted by yellow to indicate that it's hit this particular breakpoint we set. So now that script execution is paused at this point, we can go back to our debug tab, and we can take a look at some of the variables and whatnot that exist within the scope. Now, since this is a very simple module that doesn't really do a whole lot, we don't really have any local variables in scope. Or we could go poke around and look at some of the global variables, for example. Or if you had a more complicated module, you might very well have some local variables that you could look at. But in this case, we can scroll through and say we might decide that we want to look at the, for example, the config variable, which is a global within Foundry. And we can look around and see all of that sort of thing. And then, of course, your debug console here also you can use to look at stuff. Now, the scope of how to actually use a debugger is a bit beyond this tutorial. There's lots of resources out there that will teach you how to do that. But one thing I do want to point out is that if you do step, say, over your local function into a function that's something, say, provided by Foundry.js from the core Foundry directory, the VS Code is smart enough to automatically fetch that from the browser tab that it's connected to. So you can poke around and set breakpoints and whatnot, and do debugging within the files that Foundry itself is loading in. And then you can also, for example, now that we're in a Foundry function that actually does have a local scope with something in it, we can take a look at what exactly that is and do all this debugging sort of goodness that you're used to, perhaps if you know how to do debugging from other projects you've worked on.